Hi, welcome to this third session of a business ethics tutorial. Today I'd like to finish taking you through the basic theory of how to make rational choices and therefore ethical choices. I'm going to begin by finishing up some of the ramifications of the generalization principle, which I talked about in the last session. Namely, I'm going to talk about fiduciary duty and moral agency. And then I'm going to take you through the other two conditions for making ethical choices. So here we go. What is fiduciary duty? A very important concept in business. Fiduciary is from the Latin word for loyalty, so it refers to being loyal to the interests of the owners of the business, that is, the stockholders. So, for example, if I'm a member of the board of directors or a top executive of a business that's owned by stockholders, then I have an agreement with them. It's an agency agreement, and that means that I'll make decisions on their behalf, and they'll compensate me for that in return for running the business in their interests. Okay? Well, that's a very important principle in business because otherwise, if you can't trust your fiduciaries to run the business in your interest, then they won't be able to invest in businesses they don't run themselves. On the other hand, we have a notion in popular culture here in the U.S. that business ethics is all about fiduciary duty. There's nothing else to it. You simply have to maximize profit for those owners, and there's nothing else to think about. Well, let's have a look at that idea. Actually, the first question in business ethics is always, what is the ethical action for the owners of the business? So, for example, if I'm running a business, and let's say I'd like to shut down this factory in Illinois and move it to Vietnam because the labor is cheaper. And I'm going to do it because it's profitable for the business. It's my fiduciary duty. Well, first I have to ask, what if the owners of the business were sitting at my desk running their own business? Suppose the stockholders were here actually making the decisions themselves. Would it be ethical for them to do that? If so, then fine. Then I can do it on their behalf, and perhaps I have an obligation to do it on their behalf. On the other hand, suppose it wouldn't be ethical for the stockholders to shut down the business like that. I mean, I'm not making a judgment on that, but suppose it wouldn't. Then, given that, do I have an obligation to do it on their behalf when it would be unethical for them themselves, for they themselves to do it? Well, it's not so clear, is it? It's actually a promise-keeping dilemma. So what I've done is to promise owners of the business to take good care of their business in exchange for my compensation. Well, suppose that promise entails doing something that would be unethical for them to do. Then am I obligated to carry out the promise? Well, it's not so clear, is it? We have to take this one case at a time, as we always do in promise-keeping issues. So I think the lesson here is that it's always the prior question, what is ethical for the owners of the business? Because they are the guys who are responsible for the business, okay? And I'm going to address that issue for the most part. I'm going to look at what's ethical and what's not ethical for the owners of the business. Now, I'd like to move on to another issue that I skipped over a bit in the last session. And that is, I started with the assumption that people act for a reason. And then I derived everything from that. The reason has to be consistent, therefore it has to be generalizable, and so forth. Why did I start with that assumption? Well, there's a deep reason for that, and we're going to come back to it, so I think I should say something about this reason. It has to do with the way that we distinguish behavior from action. So suppose, for example, that I'm asleep at night and I leave my window open on a warm night, and there's a mosquito out there and buzzes in my window and bites me. Okay? Do I want to hold the mosquito responsible for that action? Well, probably not, because we'll say mosquitoes are just a product of chemistry and biology, it's instinct, whatever. Well, now suppose a burglar is walking by my open window and sees my wallet on the nightstand and quietly climbs into the window and steals my wallet. Okay. Do I want to hold the burglar responsible for that? Well, we tend to say, well, yes, of course, it's theft. But, you know, the burglar, his actions are determined as much by chemistry and biology, by neural mechanisms, as the mosquitoes. So what's the difference between the burglar and the mosquito? Well, over the centuries in Western civilization, we have developed a theory to explain that difference. And that difference is that the burglar's action can also be explained as ratiocination. That is to say, the burglar found reasons to climb through that window and steal my wallet. He's saying, I'm broke. I'd love to have a nice bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey, and if I can steal his wallet, I'll go down to the liquor store and get it. Okay, so he has reasons for his action. So this is how we distinguish moral agents, that is, people who make free decisions, from mosquitoes. This is why we're not mosquitoes, because moral agents can be explained, their actions can be explained as the result of deliberation, as a result of reasons they adduce for it. They may not be good reasons, but we ought to be able to attribute reasons to them somehow. Okay, this is what makes us human moral agents, and this is why the reason has to be coherent and consistent. An inconsistent reason is not a reason. Doesn't make any sense. So it has to be generalizable, for example, to make sense as a reason. Now what this means, for example, is that you don't have to be human actually to be a moral agent, as long as you can explain the behavior on the basis of reasons. So for example, very soon we'll have in our households, particularly elderly households, we'll have robots, doing the housework for us. So that raises the issue, do you have to be nice to your robot? Do you have to treat it like a moral agent? Well, once you start explaining your robot's behavior as a result of the robot's rationale and deliberation, you start thinking about the robot as someone who makes decisions based on reasons, then you got a moral agent in your house. By the way, this is not futuristic, because I actually mentioned this to a class the other day about the possibility of robots. And one of the students rose her hand and says, my grandma already has one of those things. So it's here today, okay? So it's a matter of how you regard or explain the actions of the agent. All right. Now, this notion of agency is important in ethics because it's inconsistent and irrational to destroy agency. It's a long story behind this, but no matter who we are or what we do, we can't do it unless we're agents, unless we make free choices. So it's inconsistent to destroy agency because if it's a good reason to destroy someone else's agency, it should also be an equally good reason to destroy my agency. But I can't rationally consist to anyone destroying my agency because then I can't do anything. No matter what my purposes are, I can't carry them out. So to make a very long story short, we find it to be unethical to destroy agency. And you can do that in many ways. Murder is destruction of agency. Throwing someone in jail for no reason, coercion, serious bodily injury, refusal to allow someone to develop their cognitive capabilities, and so forth. All right. We'll come back to that in a couple of our cases. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the two final conditions for making a rational choice. The first one is be consistent with your goals. This is number 2. And it begins with a premise very similar to the other one, and that is when you do something, you do it as a means to an end. Okay, there's something you have in mind. There's a goal you have in mind. So I often ask my students, why are you in class today? Well, because you're going to have a quiz. So what? So what if I have a quiz? Well, I want to make a good grade on the quiz. Why? Well, because I want to get a good grade in the course. Well, why do you want a good grade in the course? Because I want a good GPA. Well, why do you want a good GPA? Because I want that job at Goldman Sachs. Why do you want a job at Goldman Sachs? Well, I'd like to be successful and wealthy. Well, why do you want to be successful and wealthy? Let me think about that. I want to drive a Porsche and I want to live on, have a summer home on Cape Cod. So why do you want your summer home on Cape Cod? Well, I just want to be happy, I guess. Okay, I'm not sure that'll work, but I want to be happy. So at some point, you got to decide what it's all for. Okay? So whatever it is it's all for, we're going to call that utility. That's the thing, that's the end for which the rest of the means. Now you may have several ends, but you got to have at least one. So this principle says, make up your mind what the end is, what it's all for, and then stick to it. Okay, so we're starting with that. Now where does this go? What this means is that, let's say happiness is my end. That means I think happiness is intrinsically valuable. Not as a means to something else, but in itself, it's intrinsically valuable. If that's true, then happiness is good. Well, if happiness is good, then anyone should have it. I should want anyone to be happy because this is good stuff, okay? Myself or someone else. And in fact, if I have a chance to make someone else happy, I should do it because I believe happiness is good. Now, many people aren't convinced by this line of argument, so let me put it a different way. Let me ask you, what's wrong with causing people pain? Now, sometimes you cause people pain like a shot in the arm so they don't get the flu. That's okay. That's to avoid greater pain in the future. But what's wrong with causing people gratuitous pain? What's wrong with that exactly? Well, okay, I challenge you to come up with a reason why it's wrong. Right? It may be generalizable. Who knows? Okay. Well, one reason it's wrong may be that I think that pain is inherently bad. It's just something I'm going to avoid, except to avoid greater pain in the future for myself or someone else. So perhaps that's really the only reason I can think of why I want to say that I shouldn't harm people and cause them pain gratuitously. So if pain is bad, no one should suffer it. Well, I'm going to apply that same argument to the positive utility, to happiness. Okay? It's the same argument. So if you reject my argument about happiness, then you're going to have to reject my argument about pain and explain to me why it's wrong to come up and slap someone in the face for no reason. You got to explain that to me. Okay. So I'm going to accept this argument. Now, I may say, hey, you know what? Yeah, I think happiness is good, but I happen to be interested only in my own happiness. Okay? I just care about my happiness. Now, my happiness is no different than anyone else's, I grant. It's the same happiness. I only care about mine. Well, that's rational if I can make some distinction between my happiness and your happiness. But I don't. I'm just arbitrarily saying I only care about my happiness. But if it's arbitrary, there's no reason for it. That's what arbitrary means. And if there's no reason for it, it's irrational. Okay. Now, so that leads to the utilitarian test. You should choose an action that maximizes total net utility for everyone concerned, everyone that affects. Otherwise, you're inconsistent. Now, some people worry about whether you can measure utility. Okay. Actually, it's not as hard as you might think. How do you measure happiness? Well, in most cases, common sense will suffice. But if you want to know, there is a theory. There's utility theory. So, for example, if you want to measure utility against income or wealth, you can do that with a utility curve. They're usually concave curves. Here's one on the slide. So as you get wealthier, it's worth more to you, but each new dollar is worth less than the previous one because there's a concave curve here. You can actually build one of these curves for yourself. We can build one for everyone. I won't go into how to do it, but you can do it. So it's actually not so hard to measure utility. You can do it. Now, how about Jennifer? Remember her? She is the student who's looking for a job, and she got this great job offer in New York City, but she had already signed to work for someone else. And she raised the argument, I could create more utility working at this job I like in New York City than I could working at the job I don't like in Cleveland. So doesn't that give me the right or an obligation to break my contract in Cleveland and go to New York? Okay, well, let's grant that she would create more utility in New York, okay? So what that means is that breaking her contract and going to New York satisfies the utilitarian test. It absolutely does. That's great. The only problem is it violates the generalization test. You got to pass all the tests. Okay, you got to pass them all. All right. Now, there's another issue here. Don't these two tests come into conflict? Because isn't it true that she can actually create more utility working at the job she likes, because she's going to really satisfy the customers up there in New York, and she's going to be bored and unproductive in Cleveland. Okay? Well, doesn't that greater utility give her an obligation to work in New York, whereas the generalization test gives her an obligation to work with the company she signed with? Actually, no. There's no conflict here. Neither principle overrides the other. And the reason is this. The utilitarian test says that I have to choose the action that maximizes utility. But what I choose has to be an action, all right? And to be an action, it has to pass the other conditions for rational choice. So if it violates the generalization test, if going to New York violates that test, it's really not an action. I just talked about that. I'm not exercising agency because there's no coherent rationale for what I'm doing. It's basically just behavior, sort of like a twitch or a mosquito buzzing around. It's not really a human action if there's no coherent rationale. So the test for utility only requires us to maximize utility, subject to the condition that the action obeys all the other rules. Okay, so we're not required to go to New York to satisfy that condition. Okay, the same thing goes to stealing the watch in the department store I talked about. I could probably increase utility by shoplifting a watch. The store is insured, they're not going to miss it, but I get a new watch. So my gain is probably greater than their loss. Okay? That's fine, it passes that test. But it doesn't pass the generalization test. Okay? You've got to pass them all. Okay. Now some people ask, sometimes you just can't tell how to maximize utility. You really can't predict the consequences of your actions. Well, that's true. Okay? You don't have to be omniscient, though. All you have to do is be rational. You have to say, well, if I can rationally believe that no other action would create utility that's greater, then I'm okay. On the other hand, I can't be lazy about it. I have to do some research on the issue to find out, what are the consequences of my actions. It's sort of like driving to a friend's house for a party, and I don't know where the house is. Okay? Well, one way to do that is sort of hop in the car and drive around town until I find it. Okay? I could do that, but it's just not rational. It's rational to put some effort into looking at a map or a GPS system or something and find out where it is. Okay? On the other hand, I don't want to spend 8 hours researching the location before I go. Then I won't have time for the party. So this is called satisficing. You find an optimal balance between researching the issue and then taking action. This is something that, this is a term from Herb Simon, my former colleague here at Carnegie Mellon, who talked about satisficing. All right, so we'll come back to these issues later. And there's also an issue of the concavity of the utility curve. Remember I said that, as you get richer, each successive dollar is worth less to you. So $1,000 is worth less to Bill Gates than it is to me right now. Well, that means that I can take $1,000 and give it away to some very poor guy and increase net utility because he gains more than I lose. Well, doesn't that imply that I have an obligation to give away almost everything, give away sacrificially to all the poor of the world? Okay, so I'll impoverish myself, but they'll be a lot better off. They'll gain more than I lose. Do I have an obligation to do that? Doesn't that seem rather strict, rather severe? Actually, no, because it's not generalizable. Suppose everyone did that. Suppose everyone sacrificially just gave away all their assets so as to increase overall utility. That's the reason for doing it. Well, then there's nothing left to build a productive economy, right? We can't invest in infrastructure. We can't invest in our kids' education. We've given it all away. Okay? So it doesn't generalize. So everyone's going to be worse off if we generalize this practice because we won't be able to build the economy that allowed us to give things away. On the other hand, moderate generosity is perfectly consistent with increasing utility if it's generalized. So that's what we should do. We should be moderately generous. Be generous up to a point. And most people are, in fact. Now, this issue of self-interest, people get sort of upset about self-interest. Aren't we supposed to be self-interested? Well, you can still be self-interested most of the time, consistent with this principle. Because if you think about it, I'm the person who's in the best position to take care of myself. No one else can get me up in the morning and make me go to work but me. Okay? So we can control utility better by focusing on what we do personally. We have control over our own actions. There's really not much I can do about other people's welfare as my own welfare. I take care of myself first because I have control over myself. Now, as we get older and take on responsibilities, we have kids, we have clients, we have students, then our actions tend to affect other people more and more. So we have a stronger and stronger obligation to think about other people's welfare as well as self-interest. Fortunately, as we grow older, we become more mature ethically, and we have the ability to take on that obligation. Okay. So there is a role for self-interest, but it's not the end-all and be-all. Okay. The same goes for a business. Okay, what should a business do? A business shouldn't give away everything, to pro bono causes, because if businesses did that generally, they wouldn't be able to attract investors, and there wouldn't be any businesses to give things away. Okay. However, a business's primary contribution is doing its job, right? Making those products and services in a responsible way. Business creates an enormous amount of positive utility by doing its job, doing what it does best. This is the great attraction of business. You can get a lot of good things done in business. People work together. They're very efficient. They learn to do it well. They're very good at this. So this is what a business should spend most of its time doing what it does well in a responsible way, so as to create positive utility. Now, as a business becomes more mature, an established corporation, then they can start thinking about pro bono causes like building infrastructure in schools in a developing country and so forth. Okay? A startup has to be more selfish, just like a young person has to be more selfish to invest in themselves so they can invest in others later. All right. And finally, people often ask me about how to choose a career. Okay? It would seem offhand that this principle of utility would require me to go into a career where I can do the most good. I should be a heart surgeon and save lives. I should be a relief worker in the floodplains of Bangladesh or whatever. Well, if we're all heart surgeons and we're all relief workers, things aren't going to work, right? Someone, has to make toilet seats. Someone has to do these things. So what do we do here? Well, if I'm being a relief worker or a heart surgeon simply for the purpose of creating more utility, that's not generalizable. Because if everyone did it simply for that reason, we wouldn't create more utility. Okay? No one would be making cars, no one would be sweeping the floors, and so forth. Okay? So what I do is I have to have more specific reasons for my career choice. I want to create positive utility, absolutely. I want to make a contribution. And people do, I'll tell you, people want to make a contribution. Okay? But I do it for reasons that are peculiar to me, that exploit my own desires, my own vision, my own dreams, my own abilities, and that's generalizable. Okay? If we all pick a career that's positive, makes a positive contribution, and takes advantage of our peculiar strengths and interests, then that's great. Everything works out positive. Okay. The final condition is something called virtue ethics. This one's a little bit squishy, a little bit vague, but sometimes it's important. And it has to do with the principle, act in a way that's consistent with who you are. And the idea here is that, you can't decide how to live your life unless there's some basis for this decision. It has to come from somewhere, some idea about why we're here and who we are. So what we're going to do is to try to find common ground as to why we're here and who we are so that we can translate this into ethics. Now, this may seem a hopeless task, but there's actually an old tradition here. It's called virtue ethics. It comes from Aristotle. And I'll present this to you, and you can see what you think of it. So what Aristotle said is that you can sometimes explain how things work teleologically. That means you give them a purpose. So, for example, if you're explaining the human body, you can say, well, I can tell you why the heart is there. It's there to pump blood. It has a purpose. Now, you can't prove that, but it certainly helps us to understand what's going on in the body. Okay? And the way you tell what the purpose of a thing is, well, you find out what it's uniquely qualified to do in that system. Okay, so kidneys don't pump blood very well. That must not be why they're there, but hearts are good at that. That's why they're there. Okay? So Aristotle applied this idea to human beings. He can say, what are we uniquely qualified to bring to this world? And nothing else can bring. Well, he thought it was the virtues. He called them virtues like courage, intelligence, honor, friendship. Lions and tigers don't have courage. They're just brave. Right? They don't overcome their fears. They don't have courage. The squirrels don't enjoy the sunset, so far as we know. But we human beings have this aesthetic sensibility as one of our virtues, and so forth. So these virtues are what we humans uniquely have. Maybe that's why we're here. Maybe that's who we are. And if so, we should act consistently with those virtues. Okay. Sometimes a choice of career, particularly in our culture, defines who we are. So we should act consistently with the mission of our career. Otherwise, we're just alienated from ourselves. Okay. And in fact, the two prior conditions I gave to you, the generalization test, utilitarian test, are really based on our self-concept, on who we are as rational moral agents. Okay, so I'm drawing out the consequences of that. So that's really a special case of virtue ethics. Okay, so this is vague, but it does tell us that if there's no conflict of virtues, then you should not act against a virtue because it's acting against who we are as human beings. This is a different word for this is integrity. Okay, integrity comes from the same word as integer, like a whole number. Integrity means wholeness. Okay, so if you have integrity, that means you act in accordance with who you are. Now, so for example, if I double cross a friend, right, and I don't want to think about it, it keeps me up at night. I just don't want to look at myself in the mirror. It alienates me from myself. It splits my personality in a way. So I don't want to think about what I've done. So I'm losing integrity. I'm acting against who I am as a human being, because part of being human is to take care of your friends, right? If you have no friends, no friendship, you're not fully there. You're not fully human yet. Okay. So this is what integrity is. It's being consistent with who you are as a human being. Okay. It's not honesty or whatever. It's being a whole person. All right, let's go back to Jennifer. Now, Jennifer, well, she's tempted to break her word with the company in Cleveland. That's a violation of honor. According to Aristotle, honor is part of who we are as human beings. If we have no sense of honor, we're just not fully human. So that's a violation of her integrity. On the other hand, part of our integrity is building our capacity, our ability to do things. So she thinks that by going to New York, she can actually develop her rational capacity and be more competent and take advantage of her abilities. So she actually has a conflict of virtues. So in a case like that, we have to say there's no clear verdict from the virtue test. But in some cases, there is a clear verdict. Okay, so if we put up a scorecard for her decision, well, she passes 2 of the tests, but she fails the generalization test if she goes to New York without the consent of her employers in Cleveland. Okay, so the next 3 sessions, I'm going to take you through some examples, some real-life cases, starting with easy ones, and then moving on to more difficult business case studies. So see you then.